Hey everyone, I'm back with another video. This time I'm going to talk about one of the transmission related aspects of my Cobra build. There's the Cobra and here's my work area. So if you've watched some of my other videos, one of the things I've talked about at some point is the fact that if you use the standard T5 transmission or any of the standard Mustang transmissions, or if you buy a TKO and you leave the shifter in the stock location, that it's really too far back and you have to use this really awkward shifter to move the ball forward to where you need it to be, and it doesn't create a very natural shifting mechanism because it's more of left and forward, or left and down for first gear and then up for second gear, and etc., rather than an H pattern that's in a horizontal plane. So to me, one of the things that's important to do one of these builds, what I consider to be correctly, is doing a mid-shift kit. And if you're doing a T5, you have to replace the whole tail housing. This part here is called the tail housing because the main transmission is up here. This is a TKO, of course, not a T5. But on a T5, the tail housing either has a shifting area back here or up here in the middle. The TKO is provisioned to allow you to do either one. That's one of the things that makes a TKO nice for a Cobra build or anything else where you've got a mid-shift being the optimal location. So this is the TKO 600 that I have. I got a great deal off of this off of Craigslist. Thanks to Tim for giving me the great deal if you're watching. And but it still had the shifter in the stock location. So just to show you what that looks like. So this is the stock shifter. Normally it's back here, and you've got this plate up here covering the middle of it. So I've gone ahead and I've done basically all of the mid-shift conversion except put the shifter on, and I wanted to do the video with this still partially taken apart because you can see what's going on better. So a couple of things to point out. I saw one video where a guy claimed that he did the whole mid-shift conversion without taking the transmission, or without taking the mid-shift or the tail housing off. I don't really see how that's possible. He may have been able to pull it off, but I don't feel like it's the right way to do it, and I'll explain why. So when you buy the transmission in stock form, you've got this shift rod here, and it goes through this aft portion of the transmission, and it runs through this hole here, and then it goes underneath these three shifting lugs. So then you have this lug on that shaft pointing upward, and then that goes into this lug, which attaches to the center, and then basically that moves it left and right. That'll allow you to move left and right to get into your 1-2 or your 5 reverse. It's possible to get all three of these lugs off without pulling the tail housing, and then it's also possible to get the lug off of the it's also possible to then get the lug off of the main shift rod. But if you do it that way, then what happens is you're going to have to leave the rod in place, and then you're also going to have to leave, this is the shift lug that goes on the stock rod. It goes here. And I guess you could do that and it probably wouldn't interfere. I guess the way that I look at it is, why would I leave that extra weight in there, and why would I not go to the effort of taking off the tail housing? It's not a big deal. It's 6 bolts, and all you need is some anaerobic gasket maker to put it back on. It's really not a big deal. So I would advocate just doing it the way that the manual says. When you do it the way the manual says, you tap out these roll pins. I wasn't able to catch them. There is a way that you could do that. You could theoretically put a rag underneath it. That was more work than I felt like. Another trick that you can do is you could just flip the transmission over and try to kind of jiggle them out. And I actually had to do that when I was putting this back together because I dropped one of the roll pins in by accident. Unfortunately, I was able to turn it over and get it back out again. So I guess you could do that. I would just do what the manual says and take it out. So then basically knock out these 3 roll pins. What I then also did was then I knocked out this roll pin for this lug here, and when you do that, it just drops down that hole, that drain hole in the middle. You don't have to do anything special with it, so that part's nice. And then once you do that, you can take off the tail housing. You can take these lugs off before you take off the tail housing if you want. There is enough room to do that. And then once you take off the tail housing, basically all you do is you have to rotate the shaft 90 degrees so that you can get at the roll pin on this lug that's on the shaft. So then you just hammer that out. You clean up all your roll pins. You clean up the surfaces, put some anaerobic gasket maker on, and then you put the whole thing back together. You tighten these bolts to 42 to 50 foot-pounds. I did 50 just because I like to be on the tight side. And then you put the lugs in. One thing to note, so when I bought the kit that I bought, came with a new one of these center lugs that appears to be the same as the one that came off. The one I'm holding in my hand is the one that came off of the engine or transmission. But big thing to note is that factory, it's basically located upside down versus how you do it with the mid-shift kit. And that makes sense because the way that it comes from the factory, you've got your lug coming up from the rear shifter. It sticks up and then it'll move this way. The way that this will work with the mid shifter, here's your, this is a Pro 5.0 shifter, and then this just slides real nicely into there. So one other advantage I think that is going to happen with this shifter, aside from being in the proper location, you've removed a little bit of slop because you're contacting the lugs directly instead of going through an additional rod, so that's nice. Another thing, if you look at this lug here, so what you could do is you could just flip the stock shifter around and put it in the forward location, which would definitely be better than how it normally comes. But one thing with either of these is that if you look, it's got these nylon cups in there, and that's going to provide a little bit of isolation from what the transmission is doing. Now, if you're like me, I'm really building this car to be as raw and pure as possible, so I really don't want any isolation from what's going on in the transmission. So if you take a look at how this is going to work, I'm going to have my shifter, which will be solidly bolted, or my shift lever is going to be solidly bolted to the shifter. This is metal right here. That's going to be going straight into metal right there. So I should get a real raw and pure feel for what's going on with the transmission. So I'm really excited about that. I guess one other thing to note is that if you do go to the mid shifter, then you're going to lose what they call the neutral start safety. And you don't have to wire this up anyway, whether or not you want to is a personal choice. But what you have is you have this little sensor here with this ball on the end, and you see that this ball pushes in. Well, basically, this ball goes into, let me get the stock shift rod here. This ball fits right into this little recess, which is normally over here. So the recess goes right around here, and the sensor goes in this hole here. And so this is neutral, and then if you go either into the 1, 2, or the 5 reverse, then it'll push the ball in, and then if you go forward or backward, it's going to push the ball in as well. So that's what forces you to be in neutral to start the car if you have it wired up. I actually prefer the ability to start my vehicle in gear. Sometimes there's a reason why that would be useful. There was one time where that probably saved my life when an old Jaguar I had with a TKO in it stalled coming around a really tight corner at night on the Queensboro Bridge in New York, and I was able to move it with the starter away from this one lane blind pass and get around to a shoulder. It was hard on the starter, but the starter didn't die for as long as I had the car, actually, so it must not have been too hard on it. That said, there's the obvious other side of it, of if you start the car when it's in gear, it'll lurch forward and it can run over somebody, so got to take the good with the bad, I guess, for whichever version you think is safer. So anyway, all I got to do now is put some silicone, or I might even use some more of this anaerobic gasket maker. The factory was silicone, but either one will work as far as I could see. And then I have to put the block off plate over here, and then all I got to do is put on this this shifter plate over here, drop the shifter in down here, bolt it together, and then I'm all done. So if you're considering a mid-shift, I definitely think if you're doing a Cobra, it's worth doing, just to get it in the right location. It just looks so much better when you do it that way. And I'll admit that I haven't driven one with the standard shifter, but I've driven enough vehicles that shift location is really important to me, so I just can't see it being pleasurable to me the other way. But it does add a few $100. It's about $350 for the mid-shift kit plus the time, so you know, if you're on a budget, that's obviously a factor, and you got to figure out where you want to spend your money. So for me, the visceral aspects of the driving experience are really important, so anything that I touch or feel, that really matters to me, so I'd rather spend my money there. You know, some people would rather spend the money on buying a crate engine that is you know, a big stroke or 408 or big block or something, and they'd rather spend their money on that and get all the power and torque that comes with it, and that's a perfectly reasonable idea. I guess one other thing I'll say about this transmission, so this is a TKO 600. Big difference versus the TKO 500 is that it's got a 26 spline input shaft, so if you get a 500 versus a 600, you got to make sure that you buy the correct friction disc for your clutch, because obviously a 10 spline won't work on a 26 spline input shaft. They make a whole bunch of different variations of this. This one is I think it's the TCET 5008 or TECT, whatever. And the big things with this one are that it's got a 294 first gear and a 0.62 overdrive. So my 4 to 5 drop is going to be really big, because I'm literally going to be going from 1 to 1 to 0.62 to 1. So that's a big drop, but when you take a look at how that's going to work with the 373 gears I put in there, I think it's going to be really nice overall. You know, when you're thinking about building one of these cars, you're really looking at the whole vehicle, and you got a bunch of different individual systems that work together. So my recommendation to anyone that's doing this is think about which transmission you're putting in and the ratios, and then decide on the rear end. You know, there's the thing that a lot of people will tell you is that a 355 rear end is the best option for a Cobra, and maybe that's true, but I really think it has a whole lot more to do with what transmission you have, what engine you have, and what you're going to do with the car. You know, there's some people who put in 308s with the big block, and they're going 1800 RPM at 80-90 miles an hour, and they love it. If you got a car you're going to drive on the highway a whole lot with a big engine, that's a great option. So, you know, really when you're building these things, I would encourage everybody to don't just read the forums and listen to what everybody said, what a lot of people will say is the best answer. There's a lot of folks out there who really have it in their head that their way is the only way to do this, and it's not. These things are built, not bought. That's the Factory 5 motto, and you know, when you're building one of these things, you should build it the way that's going to work for you. And you know, certainly some people can give some good advice, but don't listen to something just because it's the conventional norm. So I'll get off my soapbox with that and get wrenching on the transmission box a little bit more. Thanks for watching, and I'll be posting another video soon.